In the world of elite military operations, respect isn't given, it's earned through blood, sweat, and unbreakable determination. But what happens when years of proving yourself mean nothing to those who see only your gender? What happens when the very people who should have your back become your biggest obstacle? This is the true story of Lieutenant Commander Sarah Mitchell, one of the first women to complete Navy SEAL training, and the lunch that would expose the ugly truth about prejudice in the ranks. It's a story about courage that goes beyond the battlefield, about standing up when everyone expects you to sit down, and about how sometimes the most important victories happen not in foreign countries, but in your own backyard. Some battles are fought with weapons. Others are fought with words, evidence, and the unwavering belief that what's right will prevail. This is the story of a woman who fought both kinds of battles and won them all. What you're about to read will challenge everything you think you know about military culture, gender discrimination, and the price of speaking truth to power. It's a story that started with cruel laughter in a cafeteria and ended with careers destroyed and lives forever changed. Are you ready to discover what happens when someone pushes a Navy SEAL too far? Lieutenant Commander Sarah Mitchell had faced enemy fire in 3 different countries, survived training that broke men twice her size, and earned the respect of warriors across the globe. But nothing had prepared her for the humiliation she felt sitting in the Naval Special Warfare Command cafeteria on that Tuesday afternoon in October. The laughter started low, like a rumbling storm in the distance. Sarah had just sat down with her lunch tray when she heard her name mentioned from a table across the room. Commander Jake Morrison, a man she had served alongside in Afghanistan, was holding court with 5 other officers. His voice carried just enough for her to catch fragments of his words. "You should have seen Mitchell trying to keep up during the beach run yesterday," Morrison said, his voice dripping with mockery. "I swear she was huffing and puffing like a steam engine. I don't know how she even made it through training. Probably lowered the standards for her." The other men erupted in laughter. Lieutenant Commander Rick Stevens, who had never seen combat but loved to act like a war hero, chimed in with his own comment. "I heard they had to modify the obstacle course just so she could complete it. Real SEALs don't need modifications." Sarah's fork paused halfway to her mouth. She had completed every single training requirement alongside her male counterparts. There had been no modifications, no lowered standards, no special treatment. She had earned every single one of her qualifications through pure determination and skill. The beach run Morrison was mocking? She had finished 3rd out of 25 participants, ahead of Morrison himself. But the humiliation wasn't over. Chief Petty Officer Danny Walsh, a man whose beer belly suggested he hadn't seen serious physical training in years, decided to add his voice to the chorus. "You know what they say about diversity hires. They look good on paper and in the photos, but when it comes to real operations, they're a liability. I wouldn't want her watching my back." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. A diversity hire. After everything she had sacrificed, every barrier she had broken, every mission she had completed successfully, she was being reduced to a checkbox on someone's equality report. Her hands began to shake slightly as rage built up inside her chest. Morrison wasn't finished. He leaned back in his chair, clearly enjoying the attention from his audience. "The worst part is, she actually thinks she belongs here. Walking around like she's earned her place. I've heard she's been pushing for a promotion to full commander. Can you imagine? A woman giving orders to real warriors?" The table erupted in laughter again. Sarah noticed that other people in the cafeteria were starting to stare. Some looked uncomfortable with the conversation, but no one was speaking up. No one was defending her. She was surrounded by her supposed brothers-in-arms, and she had never felt more alone. Stevens decided to escalate things further. "I bet she couldn't even handle a real combat situation. Probably freeze up the moment things got serious. Women are too emotional for this kind of work. They don't have what it takes when lives are on the line." Sarah's mind flashed back to the mission in Syria where she had single-handedly extracted a wounded teammate while under enemy fire. She thought about the night in Afghanistan when her quick thinking had prevented an ambush that could have killed 8 men. She remembered the countless hours of training, the injuries she had pushed through, the personal relationships she had sacrificed for her career. But what hurt the most wasn't the lies they were telling about her capabilities. It was the casual cruelty of it all. These men weren't discussing her performance based on facts or experiences. They were attacking her simply because she was different, because her presence challenged their idea of what a Navy SEAL should look like. Morrison stood up, his voice getting louder as he warmed to his theme. "Mark my words, gentlemen. Having women in special operations is going to get people killed. They're going to compromise missions, slow down operations, and create problems that we shouldn't have to deal with. The military isn't some social experiment. It's about winning wars and protecting American lives." The irony wasn't lost on Sarah. Morrison had never excelled in any training exercise she had witnessed. His tactical knowledge was adequate at best, and his leadership skills were questionable. Yet here he was, questioning her ability to serve effectively while his own record was mediocre at best. Walsh chimed in again, his voice filled with smugness. "The really funny thing is, she probably thinks people respect her. Like we actually see her as an equal. If she knew what we really thought, she'd probably run crying back to some desk job where she belongs." Sarah had heard enough. She stood up slowly, her entire body tense with controlled fury. Every instinct told her to march over to that table and defend herself. She could have destroyed their arguments with facts. She could have listed every successful mission, every training record she had set, every commendation she had earned. But she knew it wouldn't matter. Facts don't change prejudice. Logic doesn't defeat hatred. Instead, she made a different choice. She picked up her tray, walked calmly to the disposal area, and left the cafeteria without saying a word. But, as she walked out, she was already forming a plan. These men thought they could humiliate her without consequences. They believed their positions protected them from accountability. They were about to learn how wrong they were. Sarah had spent years building relationships throughout the military hierarchy. She had mentors who respected her work, colleagues who had witnessed her capabilities firsthand, and a reputation built on performance rather than politics. Most importantly, she had something her tormentors lacked: integrity and the courage to stand up for what was right. That night, Sarah sat in her quarters and began documenting everything she could remember about the incident. She wrote down names, recorded exact quotes as best she could recall them, and noted who else was present in the cafeteria. But this wasn't just about one lunch conversation. This was about a pattern of discrimination and harassment that had been building for months. She thought about the training exercises where Morrison had deliberately excluded her from planning sessions. She remembered the times Stevens had interrupted her during briefings, dismissing her input without consideration. She recalled the inappropriate comments from Walsh about her physical appearance and his constant questioning of her assignments. Sarah realized that what happened in the cafeteria wasn't an isolated incident. It was the visible tip of a much larger problem. These men felt comfortable mocking her publicly because they believed their attitudes were shared and accepted by the broader organization. They felt protected by a culture that had historically excluded women and still struggled to accept their presence. As she wrote, Sarah felt her anger transforming into something more powerful: determination. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for every woman who would come after her, every person who had been dismissed because they didn't fit someone else's narrow definition of what a warrior should look like. The next morning, Sarah began making phone calls. She contacted the Equal Opportunity Office, the Inspector General's hotline, and her mentor, Admiral Patricia Hawkins, one of the highest-ranking women in the Navy. She also reached out to colleagues who had witnessed the harassment over the past several months, asking them to document their observations. What Sarah didn't know was that someone had recorded Morrison's lunch conversation on their phone. A young petty officer named Marcus Chen had been disgusted by what he heard and had started recording partway through the incident. He had been struggling with whether to come forward, knowing that speaking up against senior officers could hurt his career. But, when he heard that Sarah was filing formal complaints, he decided to do the right thing. The recording would change everything. It provided undeniable proof of the discrimination and created a paper trail that couldn't be ignored or explained away. But, more than that, it revealed the casual, systematic nature of the prejudice Sarah had been facing. This wasn't about one bad day or a misunderstanding. This was about deeply held beliefs that had been shaping decisions and affecting careers. As Sarah prepared to take on some of the most powerful men in her command, she knew she was risking everything she had worked for. Speaking up against discrimination in the military could be career suicide. Powerful men protected each other, and those who challenged the system often found themselves isolated and pushed out. But Sarah had learned something important during her years as a Navy SEAL: sometimes the most dangerous missions are the ones you have to undertake alone. Sometimes courage isn't about facing enemy bullets. Sometimes it's about standing up in a room full of people who want you to stay silent and saying the words that need to be said. The war for Sarah's dignity and the dignity of all women in special operations was about to begin. And, like every other battle she had fought, she intended to win. The weeks following the cafeteria incident became a careful dance of documentation and investigation. Sarah had learned from her SEAL training that successful operations required meticulous planning, solid intelligence, and precise execution. Taking down a system of institutional discrimination would require the same approach. Admiral Patricia Hawkins had been Sarah's mentor since her early days in the Navy. A trailblazer herself, Admiral Hawkins had fought similar battles decades earlier and understood exactly what Sarah was facing. When Sarah called her that first night, the Admiral's response was immediate and supportive. "Sarah, I've been waiting for this call," Admiral Hawkins said during their secure conversation. "I've been hearing whispers about the atmosphere in your command for months. The fact that it's gotten this blatant means it's time to act. But you need to understand what you're up against. These men have been protecting each other for years, and they won't go down without a fight." Admiral Hawkins arranged for Sarah to work with Commander Lisa Rodriguez, a military attorney who specialized in discrimination cases. Commander Rodriguez had a reputation for being thorough, aggressive, and uncompromising when it came to equal treatment under military law. The good news, Commander Rodriguez explained during their first meeting, is that the military has very clear policies about discrimination and harassment. The bad news is that enforcing those policies against senior officers requires absolutely bulletproof evidence. We can't just rely on he said she said testimony. We need documentation, witnesses, and a pattern of behavior that can't be explained away. Sarah had been thinking about patterns, and she realized that Morrison and his group weren't just targeting her. Over the past year, 3 other women in various roles throughout the command had transferred out unexpectedly. One had been a pilot who had consistently received excellent performance reviews until suddenly being criticized for minor infractions. Another had been an intelligence analyst who had been excluded from high-profile assignments despite her qualifications. The third case was the most troubling. Lieutenant Jennifer Walsh, an explosive ordnance disposal specialist, had filed a harassment complaint 6 months earlier against the same group of officers. Her complaint had been investigated and dismissed as unsubstantiated due to lack of evidence. 2 weeks later, she had been transferred to a remote posting in Alaska. The official reason was operational needs, but everyone understood what had really happened. Sarah reached out to all 3 women. Lieutenant Walsh was initially reluctant to speak, having been burned by her previous experience with the complaint process. But, when she learned about the recording and the broader investigation, she agreed to provide her testimony. "They made my life hell," Lieutenant Walsh explained during a secure video call from her posting in Alaska. "It wasn't just the comments about women not belonging in combat roles. Morrison started questioning every single decision I made, no matter how small. Stevens would interrupt me during briefings and explain things I already knew to me like I was a child. Walsh, who isn't even related to me despite sharing the same last name, made constant jokes about my personal life and asked inappropriate questions about my relationships." Lieutenant Walsh provided detailed documentation of her experiences, including emails where Morrison had questioned her assignments and performance reviews that showed a sudden decline in her ratings after she had rebuffed Stevens' inappropriate advances. The pilot, Captain Maria Santos, had an even more disturbing story. She had been one of the most skilled helicopter pilots in the command until Morrison had been assigned as her supervisor. Suddenly, her flight hours were reduced, she was excluded from challenging missions, and her confidence ratings dropped dramatically. He would nitpick everything, Captain Santos explained. If I requested maintenance for minor issues, he would lecture me about being overly cautious and suggest that male pilots would push through such problems. But, if I flew without reporting minor issues, he would write me up for failing to follow proper procedures. It was impossible to win. Captain Santos had eventually requested a transfer to avoid further damage to her career. Her new command valued her skills highly, and her performance ratings had immediately returned to their previous excellent levels. The intelligence analyst, Lieutenant Commander Angela Foster, had perhaps the most professional credentials of all the women affected. She had a master's degree in international relations from Georgetown University, spoke 4 languages fluently, and had received commendations for her analysis work in 3 different theaters of operation. Morrison's group couldn't attack my intelligence or my performance, Lieutenant Commander Foster explained, so they attacked my credibility. They would question my sources, demand additional verification for my reports that wasn't required for male analysts, and exclude me from briefings where my expertise was directly relevant. They created an atmosphere where my superiors began to doubt my work, even though nothing had changed except Morrison's influence. As Sarah gathered these testimonies, she began to see the full scope of what she was dealing with. This wasn't just about inappropriate comments in a cafeteria. It was a systematic campaign to push women out of special operations and combat roles through harassment, exclusion, and deliberate sabotage of their careers. Meanwhile, Petty Officer Chen, who had recorded the cafeteria conversation, was gathering additional evidence. He had been keeping a detailed log of incidents he had witnessed over the past year. His notes included dates, times, witnesses, and exact quotes. He had also encouraged other junior personnel to document what they had seen. The picture that emerged was disturbing. Morrison and his allies had created what amounted to a hostile work environment for any woman who didn't conform to their expectations. They used their positions of authority to exclude women from opportunities, question their competence without basis, and create professional obstacles that didn't exist for their male counterparts. But Chen had also uncovered something else. Morrison had been discussing his views about women in combat roles with officers from other commands. He had been actively working to influence policy decisions and personnel assignments across multiple units. What Sarah had experienced wasn't just local harassment, it was part of a broader effort to undermine the integration of women into special operations. Commander Rodriguez was impressed by the quality of evidence they were assembling. "This is some of the most comprehensive documentation I've seen in a discrimination case," she told Sarah. "But now comes the hard part. We need to be prepared for the pushback. These men are going to claim that this is about performance standards, not gender discrimination. They're going to argue that they were simply maintaining military readiness and that any criticism of women personnel was based on legitimate professional concerns." To counter this anticipated defense, Sarah and her team began gathering performance data. They collected training scores, mission evaluations, peer reviews, and any other objective measures of capability. The data painted a clear picture. The women who had been targeted were consistently high performers whose capabilities matched or exceeded those of their male counterparts. Sarah's own record was particularly impressive. She had completed SEAL training with scores in the top 10% of her class. Her physical fitness scores consistently exceeded minimum requirements. Her marksmanship ratings were excellent. Her tactical knowledge tests showed superior understanding of special operations procedures. Most importantly, her performance evaluations from before Morrison became her supervisor were uniformly excellent. Previous commanders had praised her leadership potential, her tactical judgment, and her commitment to excellence. It was only after Morrison arrived that questions about her performance began appearing in official documents. The team also discovered something troubling about Morrison's own record. While he projected an image of being an elite warrior, his actual combat experience was limited. He had served one deployment in Iraq in a support role and had never been involved in direct combat operations. His training scores were adequate but not exceptional. His leadership evaluations showed a pattern of conflicts with subordinates and problems with teamwork. Stevens had an even less impressive record. He had failed his first attempt at special operations training and had only passed on his second try with barely acceptable scores. His performance evaluations showed consistent problems with judgment and decision-making under pressure. He had never been deployed to a combat zone despite multiple opportunities. Walsh's record was perhaps the most damaging to his credibility. He had been disciplined twice for inappropriate conduct, including one incident involving harassment of a female sailor that had been quietly resolved without formal charges. His fitness scores had been declining for years, and his professional military education was behind what was expected for someone of his rank. The contrast was stark. The women being targeted were high-performing professionals with excellent records. The men doing the targeting were mediocre performers whose own records wouldn't withstand close scrutiny. As Sarah reviewed all this evidence, she felt a mixture of anger and vindication. The data supported what she had known all along: the discrimination she was facing had nothing to do with her capabilities or those of other women in similar positions. It was about insecurity, prejudice, and the fear that capable women would expose the mediocrity that some men had been hiding behind rank and gender privilege. Commander Rodriguez began preparing the formal complaint that would trigger a full investigation. The evidence was overwhelming, but she knew that the real challenge would be ensuring that the investigation was conducted fairly and that the command structure didn't circle the wagons to protect Morrison and his allies. "We're about to enter the most dangerous phase of this process," Commander Rodriguez warned Sarah. "Once we file this complaint, word will spread quickly. Morrison and his group will know they're under investigation, and they'll do everything they can to discredit you and the other witnesses. They'll look for any mistake in your record, any personal vulnerability they can exploit, any way to shift the narrative from their misconduct to your motivations." Sarah understood the risks, but she also understood something else. The evidence they had gathered wasn't just about her case. It was about a pattern of discrimination that was affecting military readiness, damaging careers, and undermining the values that the military claimed to uphold. The next phase of the battle was about to begin, and Sarah was ready. The formal complaint was filed on a cold Monday morning in November. Within hours, the atmosphere at Naval Special Warfare Command had changed completely. Word traveled fast through the tight-knit community of special operations personnel, and Sarah could feel the tension in every conversation, every glance, every interaction. Captain Michael Barnes, the commanding officer, called an emergency meeting of all senior staff. Sarah wasn't privy to what was discussed behind those closed doors, but she could see the results immediately. Morrison and his allies were clearly shaken. Their usual confident swagger had been replaced by hushed conversations and nervous glances. The investigation was assigned to Commander James Mitchell, no relation to Sarah, who had a reputation for thoroughness and fairness. Commander Mitchell had served in special operations himself but had transitioned to administrative roles after an injury. His reputation suggested he understood both the culture of special operations and the importance of maintaining professional standards. "I want to be clear about how this investigation will proceed," Commander Mitchell announced to all parties involved. "Every allegation will be thoroughly investigated. Every piece of evidence will be examined. Every witness will be interviewed. This process will be conducted according to military regulations and will be fair to all parties involved." But fairness, Sarah quickly learned, didn't mean protection from retaliation. Within days of the complaint being filed, she began experiencing what military attorneys call informal retaliation. Her training schedule was suddenly modified to exclude her from important exercises. Requests for equipment or administrative support began taking much longer to process. Her input was ignored during planning sessions she had previously led. Most troublingly, Sarah began to hear whispers that she was being portrayed as a troublemaker who couldn't handle the demands of military life. Morrison's allies were carefully spreading the narrative that she was using false allegations to cover up her own performance problems. Stevens took a particularly nasty approach. He began questioning Sarah's mental fitness for duty, suggesting in casual conversations with other officers that the stress of special operations might be affecting her judgment. He was careful never to make direct accusations, but his implications were clear: Sarah was unstable and her allegations weren't reliable. Commander Rodriguez had warned Sarah that this would happen, and they had prepared accordingly. Sarah began documenting every instance of retaliation, every changed assignment, every inappropriate comment. She also maintained detailed records of her performance and behavior to counter any suggestions that she was having psychological problems. The formal interviews began 3 weeks after the complaint was filed. Commander Mitchell interviewed each witness separately, starting with Sarah herself. The process was intensive and, sometimes uncomfortable. Mitchell asked probing questions about every aspect of the allegations, requiring Sarah to provide specific dates, times, and circumstances for each incident. "I understand this is difficult," Commander Mitchell explained during Sarah's interview, "but I need you to be as precise as possible. Defense attorneys will look for any inconsistency in testimony, any gap in the timeline, any detail that doesn't match between witnesses. The stronger your recollection of specific facts, the stronger the case becomes." Sarah had prepared thoroughly for the interview. She had reviewed her documentation dozens of times, organized her thoughts chronologically, and anticipated difficult questions. But, even with all that preparation, reliving the months of harassment was emotionally draining. When Commander Mitchell asked about the impact the discrimination had on her personally and professionally, Sarah struggled to find adequate words. "How do you quantify the cost of constantly having to prove your worth? How do you measure the damage done by being excluded from opportunities you had earned? How do you describe the exhaustion of maintaining professional composure while being systematically undermined by your own colleagues?" The hardest part, Sarah explained, wasn't the obvious harassment. It was the constant doubt it created. When someone questions your capabilities repeatedly, when they exclude you from important assignments without explanation, when they treat your presence as a problem to be solved rather than an asset to be utilized, you start to question yourself. Even when you know you're qualified, even when your performance speaks for itself, the constant negativity makes you doubt your own perceptions. The interview with Petty Officer Chen was particularly important because he was the only witness who had recorded actual evidence. Chen was nervous about testifying against senior officers, but he had decided that his commitment to military values required him to tell the truth. "I've served with Lieutenant Commander Mitchell on multiple occasions," Chen testified. "Her performance has always been exemplary. She's technically proficient, physically capable, and demonstrates the kind of leadership we should want in special operations. The conversation I recorded in the cafeteria had nothing to do with legitimate performance concerns. It was purely about gender bias." Chen also provided testimony about the broader pattern of discrimination he had observed. He described how Morrison would assign the most challenging tasks to male personnel while giving women routine assignments that didn't utilize their skills. He recounted conversations where Stevens had openly questioned whether women should be allowed in combat roles at all. The interviews with Lieutenant Walsh, Captain Santos, and Lieutenant Commander Foster revealed a disturbing pattern of systematic exclusion and harassment that went far beyond what Sarah had experienced. Each woman had been targeted in slightly different ways, but the overall strategy was consistent: create an environment so hostile that they would choose to leave rather than continue fighting for acceptance. Lieutenant Walsh's testimony was particularly damaging to Morrison's credibility. She described how he had used his authority to exclude her from training opportunities that were directly related to her advancement potential. When she had questioned these decisions, Morrison had suggested that she wasn't committed enough to special operations and should consider transferring to a more suitable role. Captain Santos provided detailed accounts of how Morrison had undermined her flight status through a campaign of nitpicking and impossible standards. She had documented multiple instances where male pilots had made similar decisions to one she was criticized for, but had received no negative feedback. Lieutenant Commander Foster's testimony revealed the intellectual harassment she had faced. Morrison had consistently questioned her analysis and demanded additional verification that wasn't required from male analysts. He had excluded her from briefings where her regional expertise was directly relevant, claiming her perspective might be too academic for operational personnel. The investigation also uncovered documentary evidence that supported the women's testimonies. Email records showed patterns of exclusion from meetings and assignments. Performance evaluations revealed sudden changes in ratings that coincided with Morrison's arrival in positions of authority. Training records showed disparities in opportunities offered to male and female personnel. But Morrison and his allies weren't passive participants in this process. They had hired civilian attorneys and were fighting the allegations aggressively. Their strategy became clear during Morrison's own interview with Commander Mitchell. Morrison claimed that all of his actions had been based on legitimate performance and readiness concerns. He argued that special operations required the highest standards and that he had been fulfilling his duty to maintain those standards. He characterized the women's complaints as attempts to avoid accountability for substandard performance. "I have never discriminated against anyone based on gender," Morrison testified. "My only concern has been mission effectiveness and the safety of personnel under my command. If my leadership style has been perceived as harsh, it's because the stakes in special operations don't allow for compromise on standards." Morrison's attorney had coached him well. He avoided making any statements that could be interpreted as openly discriminatory. Instead, he focused on abstract concepts like standards, readiness, and mission effectiveness. He portrayed himself as a dedicated professional who was being unfairly targeted for maintaining discipline. Stevens took a similar approach, but his testimony was less polished. He made several statements that revealed his underlying attitudes about women in combat roles. When asked about his comments regarding emotional stability, Stevens argued that physical and psychological differences between men and women were relevant factors in special operations assignments. "I'm not saying women can't serve effectively in many military roles," Stevens testified. "But special operations requires specific physical and psychological characteristics that are more commonly found in male personnel. Acknowledging these differences isn't discrimination, it's realistic assessment of capabilities." Walsh's testimony was the least effective from a legal standpoint, but it was perhaps the most revealing about the attitudes driving the discrimination. He made several comments about unit cohesion and the challenges of integrating women into traditionally male units. His testimony suggested that he viewed the presence of women as inherently disruptive to military effectiveness. The investigation also revealed that Morrison had been corresponding with like-minded officers in other commands about strategies for limiting women's advancement in special operations. These communications provided evidence that the discrimination wasn't just a local problem but part of a broader resistance to military integration policies. Commander Mitchell's investigation was thorough and professional, but Sarah could see that he was struggling with the political implications of his findings. A determination that senior officers had engaged in systematic discrimination would have significant consequences for the command and, potentially, for military policy more broadly. As the formal investigation phase concluded, Sarah realized that gathering evidence had been only the first step in a much longer process. The real battle would be in ensuring that the evidence was fairly evaluated and that appropriate consequences followed from the findings. The atmosphere at the command remained tense as everyone waited for Commander Mitchell's report. Sarah continued to perform her duties professionally, but she could feel the isolation that often surrounds whistleblowers. Some personnel supported her courage in coming forward, but others resented the scrutiny and negative attention the investigation had brought to their unit. The waiting period was particularly difficult because Sarah knew that her career hung in the balance regardless of the investigation's outcome. If the allegations were substantiated, she might win the immediate battle but still face long-term retaliation and career limitations. If the allegations weren't substantiated, she would be branded as a false accuser and her military career would essentially be over. But Sarah had learned something important during this process. The investigation had revealed that she wasn't alone, that other women had faced similar challenges, and that there were people throughout the military who believed in fairness and equal treatment. Whatever the outcome of the formal process, she had already accomplished something important. She had exposed a system of discrimination and forced the military to confront uncomfortable truths about its own culture. The final phase of the battle was about to begin. Commander Mitchell's investigation report was completed in December, but the review process that followed stretched into the new year. Sarah knew that powerful forces were at work behind the scenes. The stakes had grown far beyond her individual complaint. The investigation had uncovered evidence of systematic discrimination that could potentially affect military policy at the highest levels. Admiral Patricia Hawkins provided Sarah with insights into the political dynamics at play. "Your case has reached the Pentagon," Admiral Hawkins explained during one of their secure conversations. "There are people in the Department of Defense who want to make an example of Morrison and his group to demonstrate the military's commitment to equal opportunity. But there are also people who worry that substantiating these allegations will create legal liability and encourage more complaints." The delay in resolving the investigation created additional stress for everyone involved. Morrison and his allies continued their subtle retaliation campaign, while Sarah maintained her professional demeanor despite the hostile environment. The entire command was on edge, with productivity suffering as personnel worried about the implications of the investigation. During this waiting period, Sarah received an unexpected visitor. Sergeant Major Patricia Williams, one of the most senior enlisted women in Special Operations, requested a private meeting. Sergeant Major Williams had served for 22 years and had witnessed the evolution of military gender integration from the beginning. "I've been watching your situation closely," Sergeant Major Williams said. "I want you to know that what you're doing matters. When I started my career, women couldn't even serve in most combat roles. Every barrier that's been broken has required someone to be willing to take a stand, to endure the backlash, and to fight for what's right." Sergeant Major Williams shared her own experiences with discrimination and harassment over the years. Her stories revealed that the problems Sarah was facing weren't new or unique. They were part of a long-standing pattern of resistance to military integration that had persisted despite official policy changes. "The difference now," Sergeant Major Williams explained, "is that you have documentation, witnesses, and legal support. In my day, complaints often disappeared into the bureaucracy. But the military has changed, even if some individuals haven't. Your case has a real chance of creating meaningful accountability." In January, Sarah received word that Commander Mitchell's report had been completed and was under review by the commanding officer and higher headquarters. The report's findings weren't shared with the parties involved, but rumors began circulating about its contents. Petty Officer Chen, who had become an informal source of information throughout the process, reported that senior personnel were discussing significant disciplinary actions. According to the rumors, the investigation had substantiated most of the allegations and had uncovered additional evidence of misconduct beyond what was originally reported. The first official action came in February. Morrison, Stevens, and Walsh were all relieved of their current duties pending final resolution of the disciplinary process. This was a clear signal that the investigation had found serious wrongdoing, since relief from duty was not a step taken lightly for senior officers. Sarah felt a mixture of vindication and anxiety when she heard the news. The relief from duty suggested that her allegations had been taken seriously and that evidence supported her claims. But she also knew that relieved officers often fought back aggressively, using every legal and political resource available to them. Morrison's response was immediate and predictable. He hired a prominent military defense attorney and began a public relations campaign designed to portray himself as a victim of political correctness. He gave interviews to military publications arguing that his relief from duty represented a dangerous erosion of command authority and military standards. "This case isn't about discrimination," Morrison told a military newsletter. "It's about whether commanders can maintain necessary standards without being accused of bias every time they hold personnel accountable. If we can't evaluate performance honestly without facing legal action, military readiness will suffer." Stevens and Walsh took similar approaches, claiming that their actions had been mischaracterized and that they were being scapegoated for maintaining appropriate military discipline. They portrayed the investigation as a witch hunt driven by political pressure to promote diversity at the expense of effectiveness. But their public relations campaign backfired in ways they hadn't anticipated. Other women throughout the military began coming forward with similar stories of discrimination and harassment. What had started as one complaint from one command became a broader conversation about military culture and gender integration. The additional testimonies revealed that the problems at Naval Special Warfare Command weren't isolated incidents. Similar patterns of discrimination were occurring throughout special operations and other military communities. The Defense Department found itself dealing with a much larger issue than anyone had originally anticipated. In March, Sarah received notification that the disciplinary process had concluded. Morrison was being court-martialed on charges including conduct unbecoming an officer, creating a hostile work environment, and violation of equal opportunity policies. Stevens faced similar charges, while Walsh was being processed for administrative separation from the Navy. The court-martial proceedings would be public, which meant that all the evidence gathered during the investigation would be presented openly. Sarah would be required to testify about her experiences in detail, subjecting her to cross-examination by Morrison's defense team. Commander Rodriguez prepared Sarah extensively for the trial testimony. They reviewed every aspect of the evidence, anticipated defense strategies, and practiced responses to hostile questioning. The defense would likely try to portray Sarah as an ambitious officer who was using false allegations to advance her career or to avoid accountability for poor performance. Remember, Commander Rodriguez advised, "Your credibility is the foundation of this entire case. The defense will try to make you angry, to get you to say something that undermines your testimony. Stay calm, stick to the facts, and trust that the evidence will speak for itself." The court-martial began in April with significant media attention. Military publications and civilian news outlets covered the proceedings closely, recognizing the broader implications for military gender integration policies. Sarah found herself thrust into a public spotlight she had never wanted, becoming a symbol for military women facing discrimination. Morrison's defense team pursued exactly the strategy Commander Rodriguez had predicted. They argued that Morrison was a dedicated officer who had been unfairly targeted for maintaining appropriate military standards. They suggested that Sarah and the other witnesses were disgruntled personnel who had conspired to fabricate allegations against respected leaders. But the defense faced a significant challenge: the recorded evidence from the cafeteria conversation. Petty Officer Chen's recording captured Morrison and his allies making statements that were clearly discriminatory and that contradicted their claims about performance-based concerns. When the recording was played in court, the impact was immediate and devastating. Morrison's own words exposed the real motivations behind his actions towards Sarah and other women in the command. His comments about diversity hires and questions about whether women belonged in special operations revealed the bias that had driven his behavior. Sarah's testimony was the centerpiece of the prosecution's case. She spoke clearly and factually about her experiences, providing specific examples of discrimination and explaining how the hostile environment had affected her professionally and personally. Under cross-examination, she remained calm and consistent, refusing to be baited into angry responses or emotional outbursts. The testimony from Lieutenant Walsh, Captain Santos, and Lieutenant Commander Foster established the pattern of discrimination that extended beyond Sarah's individual case. Each woman provided detailed accounts of how they had been systematically excluded, undermined, and harassed by the same group of officers. Perhaps most damaging to the defense was the testimony from Petty Officer Chen and other junior personnel who had witnessed the discrimination. These witnesses had no personal grievances against the defendants and no obvious motivations for false testimony. Their accounts corroborated the women's testimonies and provided independent verification of the hostile environment. The prosecution also presented documentary evidence showing disparities in assignments, training opportunities, and performance evaluations that couldn't be explained by legitimate performance differences. The data revealed a clear pattern of discrimination that began when Morrison arrived in his supervisory role and affected multiple women across different time periods. Morrison's own testimony was a disaster for the defense. Under cross-examination, he contradicted several of his earlier statements and appeared evasive when questioned about specific incidents. His attempts to justify his recorded comments in the cafeteria were unconvincing and actually reinforced the prosecution's arguments about his discriminatory attitudes. Stevens' testimony was even worse. He made several statements during cross-examination that revealed his belief that women were inherently unsuited for special operations roles. His comments about emotional stability and physical capabilities provided additional evidence of the discriminatory mindset that had driven the defendant's actions. Walsh chose not to testify on his own behalf, which was probably wise given his history of inappropriate conduct and his role in making some of the most offensive recorded comments. As the trial proceeded, Sarah watched Morrison's confidence gradually erode. The man who had seemed so powerful and untouchable in the cafeteria now appeared diminished and defensive. The evidence against him was overwhelming, and his attempts to justify his behavior only made things worse. The trial also revealed the broader institutional failures that had allowed the discrimination to continue unchecked. Supervisors had ignored warning signs, complaints had been dismissed without proper investigation, and a culture of tolerance for inappropriate behavior had enabled the harassment to escalate. When closing arguments concluded, Sarah felt exhausted but hopeful. The evidence had been presented thoroughly, the witnesses had testified credibly, and the defendants had failed to provide convincing alternative explanations for their behavior. But she also knew that military justice could be unpredictable and that powerful defendants sometimes escaped consequences despite overwhelming evidence. The court deliberated for 2 days before reaching its verdict. As Sarah waited for the announcement, she reflected on how much had changed since that lunch conversation in October. What had started as a moment of humiliation had become a catalyst for broader change in military culture and policy. Regardless of the verdict, Sarah knew she had accomplished something important. She had exposed discrimination, supported other victims, and demonstrated that accountability was possible even against powerful opponents. The final judgment would determine the immediate consequences for Morrison and his allies, but the broader impact of her courage was already evident throughout the military. The verdict was announced on a Thursday afternoon in May. The military court found Morrison guilty on all charges: conduct unbecoming an officer, creating a hostile work environment, violation of equal opportunity policies, and dereliction of duty. Stevens was convicted on similar charges, while Walsh's administrative separation was finalized with an other-than-honorable discharge characterization. Sarah felt a rush of emotions as the verdicts were read. Relief, vindication, exhaustion, and hope all washed over her simultaneously. The months of stress, the professional risks, and the personal attacks had been worth it. The military justice system had worked, and accountability had been achieved. Morrison was sentenced to dismissal from the Navy, loss of all pay and allowances, and confinement for 18 months. Stevens received a similar sentence with 12 months confinement. Both men would lose their military retirement benefits and would be prohibited from working for the Department of Defense in any capacity. The sentences were severe by military standards, reflecting the court's recognition that the defendants had seriously undermined military values and damaged unit cohesion through their discriminatory behavior. The judge specifically noted that leaders who abuse their authority to target subordinates based on gender or other protected characteristics betray the trust placed in them by their service and their nation. But the immediate legal victory was only part of a much broader transformation that Sarah's courage had triggered. The Pentagon had used the case as an opportunity to review and strengthen equal opportunity policies throughout the military. New training requirements were implemented for all supervisors, reporting procedures were streamlined, and accountability measures were enhanced. Admiral Patricia Hawkins was promoted to become the first woman to serve as Deputy Chief of Naval Operations for Personnel, a position that gave her significant influence over military personnel policies. In her new role, she implemented comprehensive reforms designed to prevent the kind of systematic discrimination that Sarah had experienced. Sarah's case became a catalyst for changes we had been trying to make for years, Admiral Hawkins explained. Sometimes it takes one person's courage to expose problems that everyone knows exist but no one wants to address directly. Her willingness to stand up created the momentum we needed for real reform. The 3 women who had supported Sarah's case with their own testimonies saw their careers flourish after the trial. Lieutenant Walsh was reassigned from Alaska to a prestigious posting at the Pentagon, where her explosive ordnance expertise was highly valued. Captain Santos became the first woman to command a Special Operations Aviation Unit. Lieutenant Commander Foster was promoted to full commander and assigned to lead an intelligence fusion center. Their success demonstrated that the discrimination they had faced had been artificial barriers created by prejudiced supervisors, not legitimate assessments of their capabilities. When those barriers were removed, their talents were recognized and rewarded appropriately. Petty Officer Chen, whose recorded evidence had been crucial to the prosecution, was commended for his courage in coming forward. He was selected for accelerated advancement and eventually became a senior enlisted advisor in special operations. His willingness to speak truth to power became a model for other junior personnel facing ethical dilemmas. The broader military community initially had mixed reactions to the verdicts and the policy changes that followed. Some personnel welcomed the accountability and the stronger protections against discrimination. Others worried that the emphasis on equal opportunity would somehow compromise military effectiveness or create a climate where legitimate performance concerns couldn't be addressed. But, over time, the evidence showed that the reforms had strengthened rather than weakened military capability. Units with better equal opportunity climates had higher retention rates, better performance evaluations, and fewer disciplinary problems. Diversity and inclusion turned out to be force multipliers rather than operational constraints. Sarah's own career trajectory after the trial demonstrated the potential that had been suppressed by discrimination. She was promoted to full commander within a year of the court-martial and was assigned to increasingly challenging and prestigious positions. Her expertise was sought after by senior leaders who recognized her tactical competence and her demonstrated integrity under pressure. 3 years after the trial, Sarah was selected to command a Special Operations Task Force, making her one of the highest-ranking women in combat leadership roles. Her success in that position led to her promotion to captain and, eventually to admiral, becoming one of the youngest flag officers in Navy history. The transformation wasn't limited to individual careers. The military's approach to gender integration became more systematic and comprehensive. Research was conducted to identify best practices for inclusive leadership. Training programs were developed to address unconscious bias and cultural barriers. Mentorship programs were established to support the advancement of underrepresented personnel. Sarah became a sought-after speaker on leadership and organizational change. She traveled throughout the military, sharing her story and the lessons learned from her experience. Her message was consistent: equality isn't just about fairness, it's about maximizing the capabilities and potential of all personnel. The military's greatest strength isn't its weapons or technology, Sarah would tell audiences. It's the quality and diversity of the people who serve. When we exclude capable individuals based on prejudice rather than performance, we weaken ourselves and limit our potential for success. The case also had implications beyond the military. Sarah's story was studied in business schools and corporate diversity programs as an example of how individuals can create organizational change by standing up against discrimination. Her approach of careful documentation, strategic alliance building, and persistent advocacy became a model for addressing workplace inequality in various sectors. Media coverage of the case and its aftermath helped change public perceptions about women in combat roles. Polls showed increasing public support for military gender integration, and the success of women in special operations helped dispel myths about physical and psychological limitations. Sarah was eventually invited to testify before Congress about military gender integration policies. Her testimony, based on her personal experience and her observations of organizational change, influenced legislation that strengthened anti-discrimination protections and expanded opportunities for military women. The question isn't whether women can succeed in special operations, Sarah told the Congressional Committee. The question is whether we'll create environments that allow everyone to succeed based on their capabilities rather than their demographics. My experience proves that when artificial barriers are removed, excellence emerges naturally. The ripple effects of Sarah's courage continued to spread throughout her career. Officers who had served with her carried lessons about inclusive leadership to their own commands. Personnel who had witnessed the transformation at Naval Special Warfare Command became advocates for equality in their subsequent assignments. The culture change that began with one woman's refusal to accept discrimination eventually influenced military policies worldwide. Morrison and Stevens both attempted to appeal their convictions and sentences, but their appeals were unsuccessful. Both men struggled to find employment after their dismissals, discovering that their reputations for discrimination preceded them in civilian careers. They became cautionary tales about the personal and professional costs of prejudice and abuse of authority. Years later, Sarah reflected on that October afternoon in the cafeteria when Morrison's mocking laughter had changed her life forever. What had seemed like a moment of humiliation had actually been an opportunity to create lasting change. The decision to stand up rather than stay silent had transformed not just her own career, but the careers of countless military women who would serve after her. The institutional changes that resulted from Sarah's case became part of military culture, creating protections and opportunities that new generations of service members could take for granted. The barriers that had seemed insurmountable in October had been not just removed, but replaced with systems designed to promote equality and inclusion. Sarah's story became part of military history, taught in leadership courses and studied by researchers examining organizational transformation. But, for Sarah herself, the most important outcome wasn't the recognition or the career success. It was the knowledge that her courage had created opportunities for others and had helped the military live up to its highest values. The cafeteria at Naval Special Warfare Command was eventually renovated and renamed the Excellence Center, with a plaque recognizing the importance of inclusive leadership and equal opportunity. Sarah attended the dedication ceremony, where she spoke about the difference between tolerance and acceptance, between compliance and commitment, between diversity and inclusion. This space represents more than just a physical renovation, Sarah said at the ceremony. It represents our commitment to ensuring that every person who serves our nation has the opportunity to contribute their best efforts and to advance based on their capabilities and dedication. That's not just the right thing to do, it's the smart thing to do. As Sarah looked around the room filled with military personnel of all backgrounds and demographics, she saw the future she had fought to create. The transformation that began with one woman's refusal to accept discrimination had become an enduring change in military culture, creating opportunities and protections that would benefit generations of service members to come. The laughter that had once mocked her had been replaced by the sound of genuine respect and recognition. The careers that had seemed untouchable had been ended by accountability. The barriers that had seemed permanent had been broken by persistence and courage. Sarah Mitchell had not just survived the discrimination she faced, she had transformed it into a catalyst for lasting change that made the military stronger, more inclusive, and more aligned with its core values of honor, courage, and commitment.